Hello and welcome to First Tuesdays, a monthly webinar offered by the Washington State Library as part of our strategic goal to develop professional skills among all library staff statewide. Before we get started today with our conversation about creating civil engagement and conversation with your community, we'd like to handle a little bit of business. I'm your facilitator. My name is Tammy Masonheimer, and I am the training coordinator at the State Library. And here's my contact information. If you have any questions or comments about our program today, please feel free to contact me. We also have Jeremy Stroud for technical support. Jeremy will go ahead and he'll put his contact information into the chat in case someone needs his help. And go ahead and you can ask him at any time if you get stuck or if things aren't working right on your end. We'll be recording this webinar today and it will be posted on the Washington State Library training page. First Tuesdays are brought to you by the Washington State Library, which is part of the Office of Secretary of State. Our funder is the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the LSTA Act. And as a requirement of our funding, we're going to ask that you take a short 4-question survey that will appear when you close the window at the end of the presentation today. And it's important information that we include in our annual report so we can continue our funding for trainings such as today's. And we also thank you in advance for your feedback on that. So today we have a really intriguing presentation. I want to thank Gavin Woltjerg from Montana for taking the time today to talk about creating civil engagement and conversation with your communities. At Gavin's request, questions may be entered into chat at any time and we'll try to get those to him. If not, we'll also have a time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you may have. Gavin Woltjerg is the director for the Billings Public Library, and he says when his nose is not in a good book, he enjoys exploring the outdoors with his wife Rena and their 3 children. Woltjerg also holds an MA in literature and an MA in political rhetoric from the University of South Dakota, an MLIS from the University of Oklahoma, and has completed the Leadership in a Digital Age through the Harvard Leadership Graduate School of Education. So I have to say, I did have a chance to hear this presentation by Gavin at PNLA conference last year in 2018, and was struck by his passion and engaging his community. And I'm so pleased he agreed to present today. So are you ready, Gavin?
I am ready.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Tammy. And I also like to thank the Washington State Library for asking me to share what I am very passionate about at today's First Tuesday. So basically, before we begin, there are a few caveats that have to be kind of announced before we go any further, and that's this. Whatever I share with you today, you have to personalize it for your library. The things that I share with you today, they have worked in my shop. They may not work in your shop. They may not work in your community. You have to figure out how the information that I give you today will resonate with the patrons that you serve in your own library. And make this your own. Like I said, not everything I share today will work. Some of it will be more interesting than other aspects of it. Really, there's no wrong way to do what I'm about to share. The only wrong way is not do anything at all. Another thing to keep in mind is that libraries are constantly changing in the way of our identities. And this is a really great outreach service to allow your identity to evolve, to basically reflect maybe some of the identities in your own community, and just engage with the population a lot more. However, this is a process. And by no means, after what I share with you today, will it happen overnight for you. Maybe it will, lightning will strike, and that'll be fantastic. But stick with this process for a while, and allow yourself to fail. Allow yourself to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And I'm pretty sure you will be able to do this at your shop. If you have any questions during the program, you can definitely write them in the chat box. I think Tammy then will relay those on to me, and we can kind of have more of a digital conversation. So just to begin with, this is my library. It is a LEEDs Platinum building built in 2015. We just celebrated our 5-year anniversary. It's a 70,000 square foot building. We have about 1,700 people a day come through our doors. We serve a population about 170,000 people in a square mile area the size of Connecticut. We have about 650 or so meetings, public meetings held annually in the building. We have 90 public computers that have about 400,000 internet sessions on them a year, and we circulate just under 1 million items a year. So we have a lot of different people utilizing this space for a lot of different reasons. And one thing that I noticed is that we needed to do something bigger. We needed to do something more interactive with our community. And this is where this idea about creating civil engagement with our community comes into play. So before I get into specifics about that, let me tell you my ultimate goal here. And that is, let us put our minds together and see what future we can make for our children. This is my ultimate goal. Essentially, what I want to do with this series, and we're into our 3rd season now of this series here at my library, is I want to plant trees today that will provide shade for tomorrow. It's no surprise the divisiveness of our country. It's no surprise of how we have lost the art of disagreeing without being disagreeable. We in this profession have this opportunity right now to set a different standard in civility, to be a place where opposing viewpoints can come, can be heard, argued, debated passionately, but also by being a place where respect is kept intact. So with this notion in mind, I want us to think about this. This quote from Randall H. Reed that says basically, a library is more than the sum of its collection. We are place, we are that last great civic place. We can be that place for democratic thought and argument and everything that I had already said. We could be a place for civic neutrality. We can be a place for objective reasoning and powerful dialogue. Ultimately, we can be our own little laboratory for collaboration in community building. We can be that main force in community education about differing viewpoints. Again, we're not looking to solve problems necessarily, but this notion of libraries as gatekeepers of information has to be rethought. And what I like to think about is that we're not gatekeepers, we're locksmiths. And we're constantly unlocking those areas for access to information. But then the goal is to give as many keys away as we possibly can so others can unlock this information and use it how they see fit. One thing to be aware though, when designing this program, when we talk about neutrality, when we talk about objective reasoning and all of those things, we have to be aware of our own biases. Every one of us has a bias. It's innate in us. I would ask that you would own your bias, and as you create your version of this program, you just be aware of it, you think about it, and if it starts creeping in, you identify that and you address it, then create some more. But completely eliminating bias will probably never happen, but if you're aware of it, that really is a positive for you as you go forward. So today we're basically going to talk about 3 things. And the first is understanding what civil engagement and community conversations means to the populace you serve. And that's really what I want you to focus on, the populace that you serve. Different topics, different approaches to topics are going to be different in all of our different communities. And if you try to just say, you know what, I'm just going to Xerox what Gavin has done and apply it to my community, chances are it may not work. And so I really want you to be cognizant of who do you serve? What are those issues that are affecting your community that maybe need to have that greater platform of discussion, that maybe have to be explored a little more? Secondly, it's provide steps on how to frame this program within your community. Again, there's a lot of leeway on the creativity that you can do in order to make this a successful endeavor for your library. And finally, we're going to discuss how this program is organized, how to select panelists, how to incorporate technology, and the role of the moderator toward the end. For our purpose, the Billings Public Library, we have created this as a panel discussion, but by no means does it have to be a panel discussion. It could be in a small group format, or it could be in book reviews and book clubs. It could be in coffee talks. It can be great like a panel discussion where you have a lot of different members of the community come and partake. Just know that it doesn't matter how small or large your library is, how small your staff is, or how large your staff is. You can scale this to meet the needs of your community. So before we really get into the meat and potatoes of everything, I want you to imagine the last time you heard something that you disagreed with. And I want to know, how did you react? I would guess that your reaction depended on a couple different things. One, where were you? Were you in public? Were you behind closed doors? Were you amongst like-minded peers? Were you in the minority? What was the topic? There are some topics that are definitely more polarizing than others. And also, who was the different party involved? These are all factors that have us react in some way, how we respond to a situation. Personally, I'm a very passionate debater. I love debating people about different topics. But the challenge itself, of the debate itself, is not my goal. And my goal is not to have the other person agree with me. My goal is to have the other individual acknowledge that my point of view exists. We don't have to agree. In fact, we can vehemently disagree without becoming disagreeable. I can acknowledge their viewpoint. Hopefully they acknowledge my viewpoint. If we can get to that place, and ultimately this is our goal here, if we can get to that place where we say, I disagree with you, but I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to have this dialogue, that's when the real conversation and awareness can take place. I would even go so far to argue that that's where maybe steps can be implemented for change, at least change in understanding or awareness. So it's no surprise that fake news will be with us for a while. And since the 2016 election, this has been the big phrase that's constantly being spouted. Now, I'm going to try to remain as apolitical as possible, but again, my own bias will come out, and it's not to offend anybody. These are strictly my beliefs, not even the position of my employer. But something happened after the 2016 election. And what occurred was there was this great awakening, that I like to call it, that people became very interested in topics. They became interested in wanting to know more about how government works. And this wasn't even at the national level so much as it trickled down all the way down to the local level. People had questions about, how does city government work? How does state government work? How does the federal government work? And they had some really great questions. What happened was that my foundation came to me and said, hey, we have this idea about having a panel discussion about what is fake news. And so I thought, well, that's a great idea. Let's do it. And so we put together this panel. And to be very honest, I thought this was going to be a one-off event. Maybe something we would duplicate sporadically. What I wasn't prepared for was the outpouring of just support, want, feedback from my community saying we need to have these types of conversations about a lot more different topics. Are you willing to do this? So it made me think. And it made me think, okay, what is civil engagement? And so I started thinking about that. And per Webster's, basically, we have this definition of civil that says it's relating to ordinary citizens and their concerns. Well, I think any library, if they're honest with themselves, we have so many different people that come through our doors that there's no way we're ever going to be able to fully coalesce all those thoughts together. But if we provided a space for the ordinary citizen, maybe we could provide a platform for their voice to be heard. But the second part of that definition is it's courteous and polite. Obviously, with the outcry of the 2016 election, we have seen some pretty ugly things that are hard to admit about our society. And so I made it a very strict point that this was not going to be a place where we're going to raise our voices to each other, or we're going to ridicule each other's idea or belittle the other person. This was going to be a place where we can agree to disagree without becoming disagreeable. So we created this platform. And the first time we did it, fake news, we did it in January, the day of a blizzard, no less, when Billings, we received about 17 inches of snow. And I thought, oh goodness, this is not the way to start off. And I jokingly said to my staff, we'll be lucky if 25 people show up. Well, 183 people showed up that evening. And we had a remarkable turnout, but we had a remarkable conversation as well. But there was just one problem with that first offering. I stacked the deck. I didn't knowingly or willingly stack the deck, but essentially every person on that panel thought just as I did. They related to our thoughts. We were like-minded. And so I did a really good job of reinforcing my point of view. But there were a few members of the community that called me out on it. And it really showed me this blind spot that, you know what, I did not succeed in this first offering because I did a disservice to my community by only showing one viewpoint or giving a platform to one voice. And so it made me more aware that in our panel discussions going forward, we needed to have that balance. We needed the left perspective, we needed the right perspective, but I also needed that person in the middle who could be the fulcrum. And so that evolved how we went about designing who the panelists are. But it's also meant that I had to be more aware of being completely inclusive to not only the members of the minority of voice or thought about a topic, but to any group within my community who could be possibly marginalized. And so it put it in perspective to me that every topic that we do, I try to think about it in many different lenses to ensure that that perspective is going to be across the spectrum. Now, it's never going to be perfect. I'm never going to get all the voices captured. But if I do my due diligence and I'm aware, at least I can be confident knowing that I've done my best to have a very balanced representative from every demographic or voice of collections. So we have this idea. And one thing I learned also from this first time is that good ideas can come from anywhere. The community was so excited about, hey, we should have this topic, and you should have this topic, and you should do this. And I bet you I collected about 30 to 40 different topics that first night from community feedback of what to do. However, even within those topics that my community chose, I noticed that there were other barriers I still hadn't addressed. Technology barriers. At that time, only those who attended this panel discussion could participate in this conversation. So technology, economics, social station, education level, even transportation, all became factors in me becoming more aware of who is excluded from participating in this panel. We haven't figured out all the barriers or how to circumnavigate all the barriers yet, but we're getting better and better as we go through this process. Interestingly enough, we had a banner that wasn't part of a panel discussion, but it was from the Western Heritage Center showing different aspects of prior racism that had occurred in my community. And this banner was pretty hard. It was a series of 9 different panels that were those pull-out banners that were up. And the feedback from the community was really varied. We had some that did not like that we held the mirror up to ourselves and said, yes, this is who we've been in the past. We had an individual actually who said that the banners themselves painted white supremacist groups in a negative light. And he wasn't wrong. And I had to wrestle with this new idea of, okay, what voices really are the ones that I should be thinking about in these really harder conversations. And I came down to the conclusion that I always have to be on the side of just voices. I still have not been able to articulate a good argument saying that I should give a platform or I should endorse or accommodate a voice that's going to spread hate or violence or undermine, I guess, the greatest good for our community. Now, it's a really tricky statement because, again, that's my own bias coming in saying maybe I know what the greatest good for my community is. So there's a lot of things you still have to figure out and think about. But as we go forward and we think about this conversation, I'm going to show you two pictures, and I'm a hockey fan, so bear with me here, that in hockey, we cheer on the fights. And as a society, unfortunately, we've also learned to cheer on these fights. And we reward the victor by he was the one that overcame, spoke the loudest, was the most aggressive, all of these things. We have done our best to eliminate this notion that the loudest voice is right, or even the majority voice is right, where we have said, no, our goal here is to bring about different perspectives, not to solve an issue. Our panel discussion, we'll get more into the details, it's only 90 minutes. For me to say we're going to solve a problem in 90 minutes, wow, that's pretty bold. I would say that's a little arrogant on my part if I believed that. So our goal is never to solve an issue. Our goal is to bring awareness, to bring disparate voices, to get us to acknowledge the other viewpoint. It said basically that in some research that I did, 90% of politicians are unwilling to cross party lines. 86% of politicians care only about being reelected. And 83% of them have a lack of respectful dialogue with their colleague. If that's being showcased at our highest levels of government, the trickle-down effect of that is detrimental. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to eliminate those aspects. We're not doing this because we have an agenda. We're not doing this because we're going to set a narrative in motion. We're not doing this because we think a topic needs to be brought to the forefront to be solved. Again, we're bringing awareness. We're bringing a place where people can come together, disagree, but not be that loudest voice in the room. Not to be so aggressive that it instigates more confusion or hate or frustration or anything like that. I like to think we've been pretty successful about that. Outside of that first example, we've been pretty fair and balanced. Again, not perfect because we're going to have our own bias. So how do we frame this program? Essentially, first we have to start thinking about time and place. In your library itself, you probably have a place where you can think about having a routine, creating a schedule. Not all of your topics or ideas are going to be the best idea at that time. And so you have to temper this a little bit. Sometimes a topic has to be put back on the shelf. It's not the right place. It's not the right time. And you do have that power of making sure that it's not censorship necessarily. It's more of awareness for you. There are a few landmines that I have stepped on because I thought a topic was really good at a certain time, and by golly, we were going to do it regardless of the political climate in my own community. That has bit me in the backside a few times. So when we select a topic, we have to think about what topics are important to our community, and then who decides. I have made it that community members decide our topics. I have made it that I have a panel of 8 or a committee of 8 who kind of vet some of my ideas so that I'm not the gatekeeper. There's a checks and balances here. I have to be aware of other things that are happening in our community that may have some type of conflict with the topic that we're going to discuss. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that this is promoted far and wide. So we have an advertising plan. We use social media. We use Facebook Live now. And we also use Yellowstone Public Radio to create this digital collection of these conversations. To date, we've had about 10 of these conversations. This is in our third season right now of our Civil Conversation series. We've had about 1,600 people physically attend these conversations. But once we implemented Facebook Live, we did fake news 1 year later. And the newspaper in town, the Billings Gazette, Facebook Live this. We had 170 people in the community room who attended this. But this went out to 25,000 unique Facebook feeds. And what was really interesting about that is that of those 25,000 unique accounts, we had over 5,000 of those accounts interact with our program. They liked it, they shared it, they watched it for a certain amount of time, they viewed it, they interacted with it. That realization of extending outward into our digital community gave me an awareness of also of how do we get more people talking about our conversations. This year, in our first conversation, we did the opioid crisis. And it was very interesting because that one, we only had about 70 people attend that event, which is a very good stat there, but nowhere near the 128 people that we average at these events. And I became acutely aware that talking about addiction, talking about drugs, talking about the impact in our community, people were really, really uncomfortable discussing this. However, the feedback received after that discussion was incredible because we were holding up the mirror to who we are as a community and saying, how are we addressing X, Y, and Z from a criminal justice perspective or from a social services perspective? What's the library doing to help with this? What's the PD doing to help with this? And it truly was a community event. We have two other really great ideas that we're going to be offering. And the first one is Heart Mountain. And for those of you who don't know what Heart Mountain is, that was a Japanese internment camp that's located in Wyoming, about 60 miles from Billings. And what we want to do with this next idea, this next panel discussion, is to start a different conversation about owning our history. We're not trying to set an agenda. What we're trying to do is bring awareness that some parts of our history, they're not pretty. And it can be extremely embarrassing to own parts of our history. But in order for us to have a better awareness, a better conversation, a better step forward of healing, possibly, if I can be that bold to say, we have to have this harder conversation. Now, sometimes I said, you'll step on a landmine and you don't even know that landmine is there. That occurred when we had a panel discussion on civility in America. And this happened right the day after our special election in Montana. Our previous House of Rep member went up into the president's administration, and so we had this open seat special election happen. The night before, we had this civil conversation. The newly elected, or I guess it wasn't newly elected, it was right before election night, the candidate gets in an altercation with a reporter from The Guardian. If you recall, there was a physical outcome to that altercation where this candidate body slammed a reporter. So here we are talking about a nationally elected House of Representative member doing what he did. And then the very next day, we're going to talk about civility in America. To say that was a heavy conversation would be an understatement of the year. When we started off that night, the air was already out of the room, because how could I not bring that up knowing that we're going to talk about civility in America? The landmine that happened is all of a sudden we had local and state and national news outlets calling me, asking me, did you plan for this? Well, no, I can't plan for two people to have an altercation, then talk about civility the very next day. It was just one of those instances where the stars aligned for better or worse, and we had to address it now. But the outcome of that, again, it was so heavy that we really didn't have a good conversation. I think a lot of our hearts were broken as Montanans about what had just transpired. It wasn't necessarily the outcome of that election. It was a simple fact of, here we're talking about this issue of civility, and our own political figure displayed no civility at all. And so this was an unintended consequence, obviously, but it was a landmine nonetheless. So going forward from that, and that was our third conversation that we had in that first year, we started really thinking more along the lines of the organization and execution of this series. And we started thinking about the format a little more. Okay, so we want to have a panel discussion, 90 minutes, as I said. It's broken up into three distinct parts. We have 60 minutes where the panelists answer questions from the moderator, 20 minutes of questions from the audience members back to the panelists, and then 10 minutes of final thoughts for the panelists. Now, how we do it here is I come up with 10 questions for these panelists. And I take about anywhere from 2 to 3 months researching the topic that we're going to discuss. I read some books about it. I research some articles, what have you. By no means do I become the expert. But of all of our civil conversations, of the 12 that we have done, 10 of them I have acted as the moderator. And I'll get into the moderator responsibilities in just a second. But I come up with these 10 questions. And even though we say this is a conversation, which most conversations are organic and they're not scripted, I give the questions to the panelists. I give them about anywhere from 3 to 5 days prior to the event happening. And the only reason I do that is because, one, we are under a 90-minute time restraint, but also these questions are never intended ever to play gotcha to any of the panelists. These panelists are providing their time and their expertise, and I want to highlight their expertise as much as I can to the community that's attended these events. So we come up with the panelists, and these panelists are basically, again, are experts in their fields. Now, credentials will vary depending on who the expert is. This last time with the opioid, the local impact of opioids in our community, we did something different where we had a phenomenal, very powerful testimony of a woman who is currently in the throes of addiction. And we had never done this before. Basically, I gave her 10 minutes to just talk. And it was raw. It was really real. I don't think there was a dry eye in the audience, but it really brought home what addiction means for this one person. And so we've changed it up a little bit, but I still had my 3 main panelists. I had a physician, I had someone from the drug courts, and then I had someone from social services who kind of oversees some of the outlets of resources for these individuals with addiction. And again, it was very powerful. But that's an example of us changing the script sometimes depending on the topic itself. And I would recommend actually having testimonials because it personalizes the topic a little more as well. Sometimes you have to be a little bit aware, I guess, of if you're having a bunch of panelists that have a bunch of academic credentials. And for full disclosure, I was a prior dean of a university library system before I came into public library land. That I'm very aware that we have to ensure whomever is on the panel that they convey their information in a way that's relatable to everybody in the audience, and not just those who are highly educated, not just those who have some type of expertise about the topic that's being discussed, but for all. And more importantly, we want this balanced perspective. Okay, there are arguments with the opioid example that In Montana itself, opioids are actually number 4 when it comes to things that we should be really worried about. Marijuana, meth, alcohol are usually in the top 3. So you still have to be aware. You have to create the environment for your panelists through the formatting that you choose. And then ultimately, you have to bring technology in to be aware of who's physically in the audience, but also to that digital audience. We still haven't figured out how best to capture questions from the physical or from the digital audience so that they can have more of a participation. But one thing that we did learn of, when the 20 minutes comes for the audience Q&A, we learned that if we just let it out and the audience has full access to the panelists, you always have that one person, even if we say, hey, 1 question per person, please. They say, okay, I have 1 question with 17 parts, and they monopolize the time. So what we've learned is we give out a note card to every person in the audience, and they are free then to write their question on this note card. I have 3 or 4 different individuals who are collecting these note cards, and what they do is they vet these note cards, these questions, before they reach me as the moderator. Again, it's not to censor anything, but we want to make sure that we're not creating any gotcha moments. That, again, there's going to be bias in there. So whomever is collecting those questions, I guess I'm trusting that whatever questions come to me add to the value of our conversation. They have different representations from the left side or the right side, but that we're not putting our panelists in any precarious situation like that gotcha moment. And then ultimately recording the event, because I do think that there are a lot of individuals out there that would like to access this collection down the road. As I said before, Yellowstone Public Radio has recorded these events, and what they do is they have played some of these events back during daytime programming. Again, not perfect, because sometimes you have an audience member that will ask a question regardless if they have been called on or not. So you have some audio issues and things of that nature. But for the most part, we can capture it all, and we follow this format. Now, as a moderator, basically, there are two different ways to think about this. You can do this way with Cartman: you will respect my authority, and the moderator is in charge. Okay, that's one way to go about it. However, again, I want to create an inclusive environment where audience, community, panelists, myself, all interact. So I try to think of it this way: balancing the perspectives. As the moderator, I can come up with these questions and everything else, but one thing that I have learned through this process is this: if I'm really engaged and someone says something that's quite astute, as a moderator, I have no problem saying, you know, panelist A, you just stated this. Can you elaborate a little more? Or panelist C, you said this. Panelist A, you said this. Where's the middle ground, panelist B? And try to engage and have that more conversation, less scripted environment. But I'm also the timekeeper. Because we do only have 60 minutes to go over 10 questions, I want to make sure that every panelist has an opportunity to put in their 2 cents. But it's also really, really important that I don't start with the same panelist every time, nor do I finish with the same panelist every time. I might start with panelist A, the first question, panelist B, the second question, C, the third question, but then it might be C again for the 4th question. But I make sure, and I keep pretty copious notes about who finished, who started a question, so that there's constantly a variance of perspective, who gets the first word, who gets the last word. And then again, just engaging the panelists and the audience. But I'm also kind of the referee for the Q&A period. Again, I don't want my panelists feeling as if they're put into an uncomfortable position, because they are donating their time, their expertise to help our community understand a topic at greater length. Right now, I've been really, really fortunate that because Billings has an opportunity of population and size and everything, we have a couple of universities in town, that I'm able to find a lot of really great credentialed experts to sit on our panel. But this idea has also gone up to Humanities Montana, and they have a whole treasure trove of speakers and grants and opportunities that I can engage with to bring in different viewpoints. Right now, we're really focusing on our own community. Again, we're taking some pretty big national conversations, and what we do is we try to distill them down, these topics, to how is it impacting our community. And so I really focus on our community as a whole, of where my panelists come from. If I had closer proximity to Bozeman or Missoula with the bigger colleges, I would definitely probably plug in there a little bit. Right now, we haven't done that. Okay, so essentially, through this whole process, we look at how are the topics chosen, what's it mean for our community, how are the panelists chosen, how do we do this research, how do we get greater involvement to all aspects, from the moderator to the panelists to the audience, both physical and digital, and to our community at large. This is a wonderful service. It's been fun to design this, to build it up. We're not perfect. We have bias. We have our own blind spots. But the community's involvement, the community's support for this program is just becoming deeper and deeper. And we're going to explore harder issues. As I said before, we're going to explore Heart Mountain, but we're also going to explore policing in America. In Billings, over the last 2 years, we've had 13 police-involved shootings, which is absolutely insane. When you look at the statistics going back before those 2 years, we had maybe one involved shooting per year before that. Something needs to be discussed. Something needs to be addressed. But my goal isn't to put the PD on the stand to defend themselves. My goal is to, let's bring awareness. Why are these shootings happening? Why? What are the variables that are involved? How can we better understand it? Is there something that we can do as a community to make us safer or more aware, better supporters? I don't know. And again, we're not going to find all the answers, and we're not going to solve this problem. But if we can get 128 people who average coming to these events, if I can get 128 people to go out and then have micro conversations about this topic with their different individuals of influence, and those people go out and continue these micro conversations, I believe all of these conversations will coalesce at some point, and change will happen. It may not happen in a month, it may not happen in a year. That's okay, because we're getting people to think about these topics. We're getting people to want to be involved, to have their voices heard, and ultimately to help our community understand some really difficult things. It's not perfect. We have more that we have to learn from, change, but we're incorporating different voices in our community. And ultimately, that is the goal. Hopefully, we've planted some trees for shade that will be used by others tomorrow. And if we can solve something, if a problem is solved, fantastic. At least we can acknowledge that we have brought awareness to these topics. So I threw a lot at you. I know you probably have lots of questions, but again, the thing I can stress the most to you is take this information and make it your own. Scale it to the size of community that you serve. Scale it to the size of your available expertise in your community. What I strongly suggest is don't do nothing. okay? We're at a time right now where voices need to be heard. Even opposing voices need to be heard so that we can come together and we can talk about really difficult things that, if left alone, if ignored, are only going to create so many more problems down the road. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them at this time.
Thank you, Gavin. If you do have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat. I don't see anything there right now. Can you tell us, has anyone else in your community picked up the mantle, so to speak, and started having more conversations like this?
Well, you know, not in the community per se, but the State Library for Montana, I have shared this framework with them. It is their intent to make it scalable to all the other libraries in the state. And I think that, you know, so we've addressed some pretty hard topics. We can have issues such as, maybe there's a busing issue, maybe there's a dangerous intersection. It doesn't matter what the topic is. It's the goal is to bring your community together to start talking collectively about an issue. So hopefully the state is able to use this framing and bring it to the most rural areas, urban areas, academic libraries, private libraries. It doesn't matter.
Okay, and that was kind of the question. Emma wrote, what are some of the other topics you've done for these? And I'm assuming like other community groups in the state library.
Yeah, but for the topics themselves, we've talked about fake news 1 year later, monuments in America, censorship, politics of food, politics of the Me Too movement. We've even done some softer topics of the literary landscape of Montana and celebrating who we are. We've looked at Native American and European relations. So we've got some pretty heavy topics. And I don't suggest doing heavy all the time because that can cause a little fatigue, both for your audience and for yourself. But don't shy away from addressing those really harder topics.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions that have come in so far. Have you had anybody, you know, come up and say that they've actually decided how to speak to other people about with dissenting views from their own? Have you changed the communities?
Well, you know, I don't know if we've had a large impact like that. Individually, there have been some participants that have come and said, basically, Gavin, you're full of crap, but you know what? Thank you for allowing us to share our thoughts. And, you know, I'll take that because even with that change, that means that they're thinking, that they're going to be, that they're engaged. And again, it's not to create, hey, agree with me, it's to bring awareness.
Right, exactly. So since there's no more questions, I think we're going to, oh wait, I've got one. So someone says, excellent presentation, lots of food for thought and nice slides. She liked it all.
Well, thank you.
And then have you had anyone tell you a panel discussion changed their mind?
No, but I have had people say that it reinforced their position. So, again, that kind of went back to that when I stacked the deck that first time. There were a lot of people that agreed with what we had done or the position that the panelists took. While that is nice to hear that I did something that reinforced their position, I also want those who are so entrenched in their position to think about the other perspective.
That can be a challenge sometimes.
It is.
So, yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to add, Gavin, before we close for today?
No, if you have my contact information there for anybody, I'm going to share some of the presentations that I've put together. You have questions, email me. I would love nothing more than to have every one of you who are listening today incorporate this into your library, into your community, because I think we really need to have these types of conversations coast to coast if we're going to make any difference or have any change happen.
Exactly. So it's kind of like we've given a mandate to go forth and host these conversations now, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who attended today, and especially to our speaker. If you have enjoyed this session on challenging our civil engagement in your community, the webinar will be available later today on the Washington State Library training page, and you're welcome to tell your coworkers or revisit it at any time. And please remember to take the survey at the end or follow the link available on the First Tuesday's archive page. So next month, our First Tuesday's webinar will be May 7th, again at 9 o'clock in Pacific time. Our presenter will be Dr. Michelle Martin, who is the Beverly Cleary Endowed Professor at the iSchool at the University of Washington, and she will be presenting on Reading Life Between the Lines, which is using children's and young adult literature to have tough conversations about diversity. So again, we want to thank all of you for attending today, and thank you to Gavin, and have a great day.